To be born to a great American fortune is to inherit a script. The lines are written, the exits are sealed, the audience is already seated. Most heirs read their parts and disappear into yachts and ballrooms. A few become something else. 3 men, born into railroad coke, into the patent that made the modern world plastic, into the chemical empire that wrapped the 20th century in nylon and Kevlar, walked off the page. Each one of them, in a different decade, picked up a weapon and killed a man in front of witnesses. The money did not just spoil them, it made them monsters and then paid the bill. If you enjoy stories the history books left out, subscribe so you never miss what comes next on Old Money Corrupts. There are darker rooms in the American mansion than most of us were ever shown, and this is one of them. Chapter 1. The Pittsburgh boy who was born wrong. He was the son who could not be sent to school, could not be sent to Europe, could not be sent anywhere, and Pittsburgh quietly hoped the money would hold him. Harry Thaw was born in February 1871 into the kind of fortune that did not yet know what to call itself. His father, William Thaw, had risen on coal and on the steam packets of the Ohio River, then on the Iron Horse, then on the Connellsville coke beds that fed Andrew Carnegie's furnaces. When William died in 1889, the estate was reported in the Pittsburgh papers at roughly $40 million. In the money of 1926, that figure was already a fairy tale. In the money of today, it is a sum that would buy a small American city. William had made it by waking before dawn for 40 years, by reading rail timetables until his eyes hurt, by holding ground in negotiations the way he held ground in life. He gave each of his 10 children an allowance, and he gave Harry the worst piece of the inheritance, which was no real reason to do anything ever again. The boy was difficult before he was a boy. He cried for hours in his crib and could not be quieted. He bit nurses. He attacked smaller children at the country day school in Sewickley, and his mother Mary Copley Thaw, a small, relentless woman from the Copley pew at 3rd Presbyterian, would arrive in her carriage to apologize and to write a check. Money cleaned every floor he walked on. By the time he was a teenager, he was being expelled from one boarding school after another, and the family doctor had begun to use the word that would follow him for the rest of his life: neurasthenic, hysterical, wild. The boy is wild. The boy needs a sea voyage. The boy needs a hunting trip. The boy needs Pittsburgh to forget him for a year. He was sent up to Harvard in 1889, the year his father died, and he lasted long enough to be remembered for a single famous incident. He pursued a handsome cab driver across Harvard Yard with a shotgun and a hunting whip in mid-afternoon in front of half the college because the driver had asked him for the fare. The university sent him home. Mary went to Boston and tried to buy him a second chance and could not. She brought him back to Pittsburgh. She set an allowance of $80,000 a year, an amount that would equal more than $2 million a year today, and gave him the keys to the world. He used those keys for the next 15 years to run a private campaign against women. He paid Parisian and New York dancers to spend nights in private suites with him so that he could whip them. He used cocaine. He used morphine. The women complained. The women were paid. The matter died. Mary handed her checks to her son's attorneys, and the attorneys handed them to the women, and the city moved on. This is how the architecture of impunity begins, not at a courtroom, not at a trial. It begins in a quiet office, in a quiet street, with a quiet check, and a quiet woman who would rather have the money than the story. By 1903, Harry Thaw was 32 years old, unmarried, unemployed, and the son of one of the richest widows in the United States. He kept rooms at the Lorraine Hotel in New York. He carried a heavy gold pocket watch and a .32 caliber revolver. He had developed a particular fascination after midnight, in seats near the stage. He went to the Florodora show 17 times in a single season, and one of the girls on stage, a 16-year-old chorus girl from Tarentum, Pennsylvania, had begun to draw him toward the only event that would ever interrupt his quiet life. Chapter 2. The most photographed girl in America. She was 16 years old, and her face sold soap, cigarettes, and theater tickets to people who would never see her up close. Evelyn Nesbit had come to New York from Pittsburgh poverty, raised in tenement rooms after her father, a lawyer, had died young and left her mother with nothing. The mother packed 2 trunks, took the train east, and rented a room in Lower Manhattan, and the daughter went to work. Mrs. Nesbit hawked Evelyn to photographers, to artists, to magazine editors, to anyone who would write a check. She had what one painter called a flame, a quality you could not buy or train, that fell on every surface in the room. She sat for the artist James Carroll Beckwith. She sat for Charles Dana Gibson. Her face appeared on calendars, on programs, on cigarette cards, on the covers of Sunday supplements, and in 240 separate publications by the time she was 17. In the autumn of 1901, she joined the chorus of Florodora at the Casino Theater. She was the youngest girl in the line, the prettiest, and quietly understood to be available to a particular kind of older man for a private dinner. There was an entire society of men who lived inside this arrangement and who paid the bills it generated. The most powerful of them was Stanford White. Stanford White was 47 years old when he saw Evelyn Nesbit step into a private room above his architecture office on West 24th Street. He was the partner of McKim, Mead, and White, the most successful architectural firm in America. He had built the Washington Square Arch, the original Madison Square Garden, the Boston Public Library, and the new Pennsylvania Station. He had drawn the cottages for the Astors and the Vanderbilts at Newport. He was married, he had a wife and a son, and a house in the country at St. James, Long Island. He kept 3 private rooms in New York, one of them above a stable on West 24th Street, in which he had installed a velvet swing on long ropes from the ceiling, so that a young woman could swing through a hanging paper parasol while a private camera made the picture. Evelyn Nesbit had been on that swing the first night she met him. She was 16. He had drugged her champagne later that month. She woke at his apartment with no memory of the hours between. He explained the matter to her with the practical kindness of a much older man, and arranged a series of further meetings, and paid her mother an allowance and built a particular kind of cage around her under the name of patronage. This was the life Evelyn Nesbit was living when Harry Thaw began to send her flowers. He sent dozens of bouquets to the stage door. He sent jewelry. He had paid the doorman at 3 different theaters to inform him whenever she arrived and whenever she left. He took her to dinners at Rector's and at Sherry's. He took her to Paris and to Bavaria and to a particular castle near Munich, where, by Evelyn's later sworn testimony, he held her for 2 weeks and beat her with a dog whip. She returned to New York and would not speak to him for a year. He sent more flowers. He sent his mother. He proposed marriage 4 times. In April 1905, she agreed. Before the wedding, with the Thaw family lawyers in attendance, Harry insisted that Evelyn tell him in his mother's parlor exactly what Stanford White had done to her. She told him. The story took nearly 3 hours. She was 20 years old. He listened and he wrote in his diary that night, in a hand that the prosecution would later show to a jury, that White was the beast and that he, Harry Thaw, had been appointed by God to put a stop to the beast. He used those exact words. He underlined the word beast. He went to bed. Their wedding was small in Pittsburgh, with no New York society present. Mary Copley Thaw refused to let a Florodora girl into her drawing room without supervision. The bride was given a brief, cold blessing. The honeymoon was paid for out of Mary's account. The young Mrs. Thaw kept the family lawyer's card in her purse, and she kept her own counsel, and she went home with a husband who had begun, by the spring of 1906, to keep a list. The list was of theaters at which Stanford White had been seen. It was of restaurants. It was of nights and dates. It was of the path of a man through a city. By June 25th, the list had a circle drawn around an event on the rooftop of Madison Square Garden. He underlined that one too. Chapter 3. The Beast. On the Roof. The whole of New York fashionable society was on the rooftop of Madison Square Garden that night, and the architect of the building was the guest of honor. Madison Square Garden was the second iteration of the building, opened in 1890, designed by Stanford White himself, with a high tower modeled on the Giralda of Seville and a rooftop theater that was the most glamorous summer venue in the country. The opening of Mam'selle Champagne, a new operetta, had drawn 900 guests. The night was warm. Champagne was in every hand. The orchestra was set up on the south end, and the audience sat at little tables on the open deck under the stars. Stanford White arrived alone at 11 o'clock and took a table near the front. He was 52. He was suffering, his doctors had told him, from severe debt and severe overwork. He had drunk a great deal that evening. He sat down with a relief that the people at his table noticed. He was a man who had outlived 2 presidencies of his own kind of New York. He did not see Harry Thaw enter the rooftop at 11:15. He did not see Thaw cross the floor in evening dress. He did not see the .32 caliber revolver slide out of an inside pocket. He felt the first bullet enter under his left eye. The next 2 went into his face. He fell across the small table. The pianist on the stage was in the middle of a song called "I Could Love a Million Girls." The song stopped. The dancing stopped. The audience did not at first understand what had happened. Thaw stood over the body for a moment, then turned. He walked the length of the rooftop, with the revolver held barrel up beside his ear. He passed his wife on the way. Evelyn Nesbit was standing with friends near the exit. She looked at him with a calm that the witnesses described as unnerving. He said, by some accounts as he passed and by others as he was led away by the fire warden, "You ruined my wife." He surrendered the gun. He sat down on a chair near the elevators and waited for the police. 900 people had seen it. The architect of the building lay dead under the dome he had drawn. New York stopped breathing. By morning, every newspaper in the United States carried the story, under banners that ran across full pages. By afternoon, a wire service photograph of Evelyn Nesbit, taken by the Sarony studio 4 years earlier, was being printed on the front of a Cincinnati afternoon paper, then a St. Louis paper, then a San Francisco paper. The face that had sold soap was now selling murder. By the 3rd day, Mary Copley Thaw, at home in Pittsburgh, had instructed her attorneys to engage the most famous criminal defense lawyer in the United States, Delphine Delmas of San Francisco. The first trial opened in 1907 and was a circus. Delphine Delmas argued, in a phrase that entered the American legal vocabulary, that Harry Thaw had suffered from a temporary state of madness he called Dementia Americana, the natural rage of an American husband at the man who had defiled his wife. The jury hung 7-5 for conviction. Mary paid for a second trial. In 1908, that jury reached a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Harry Thaw was committed to the Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane in upstate New York. Mary, the small, relentless woman, had spent the equivalent of more than $30 million in today's money on her son's defense. She would spend the rest of her life writing further checks to make sure he never stayed in a hospital for very long. Harry would walk out of Mattawan in 1913, would horsewhip a teenage boy in a Kansas City hotel room in 1917, would be committed again and released again. He would die of a heart attack in Miami in 1947, a rich old man surrounded by no one. The man he killed, the architect Stanford White, had died alone on a rooftop he had drawn with his own hand. The fortune that had created the conditions for the killing had paid for the trial that erased the consequence. Chapter 4. The Boy. The plastic-built Bakelite paid for the yacht, the Riviera house, the Spanish villa, the London flat, and the very specific kind of childhood that has no center of gravity. Leo Hendrik Baekeland had come to America from Ghent in 1889. A chemist with a fierce small body and a habit of speaking only when he had something to say. He had earned his doctorate in chemistry at 21. He had sold a photographic paper called Velox to George Eastman of Kodak in 1899 for $750,000 in cash, the equivalent of close to $30 million today. He took the money home to Yonkers on the high bank of the Hudson and built a laboratory in the carriage house behind the family home. He was in his 40s. He had a wife and 2 children. He was free now to chase a single idea. The idea was a synthetic resin. He had read of phenol and formaldehyde reactions a decade earlier and believed that under sufficient pressure and at sufficient temperature, the reaction could be controlled and the result could be molded into anything. He worked for 5 years. He kept a laboratory journal in clear black ink with the date written at the top of each page, and the pages survive today at the Smithsonian. On June 18, 1907, he produced the first piece of a hard, brown, perfectly stable substance. He patented it as a substance he called Bakelite. It was the first fully synthetic plastic in the history of the world. The patent was filed and granted with extraordinary speed. The trade press of the day called Bakelite the material of 1,000 uses. Within months, the small Yonkers laboratory had become a workshop, and within 2 years, a small factory. By 1920, every telephone in America was made of Bakelite. Every radio housing was made of Bakelite. Every electrical insulator was made of Bakelite. The General Bakelite Corporation, of which Leo was the principal shareholder, was one of the great industrial properties of the United States. In 1939, the Union Carbide Corporation acquired Bakelite for $16.5 million in cash and stock, the equivalent of more than $350 million today. Leo Baekeland retired to his estate at Yonkers, kept a strict daily schedule of reading and walking, became increasingly eccentric in his old age, and died in 1944 at the age of 80, eating his meals out of tin cans because he believed cooked food was being interfered with. The discipline that had built the fortune cracked at the end. The discipline did not pass to the third generation. Brooks Baekeland was Leo's grandson. He was a tall, handsome, cold man, with a charm that worked instantly on women and slowly on men. He had been to Princeton. He had served as a pilot in the war. He spent long summers climbing in the Andes and the Karakoram. He published a small adventure memoir of one expedition. He had a small private income from the trusts, and no real intention of working. He married a girl named Barbara Daly in 1942. Barbara was beautiful, sharp-tongued, socially ambitious, and from a modest Catholic family in the Bronx. She had been a model in New York before the war. She wanted to enter the social world the Baekeland name allowed her to enter, and she could see, almost from the day of the wedding, that her husband had no intention of helping her. Brooks preferred mountain climbing and adultery. He had affairs throughout the marriage and made no effort to hide them. Barbara responded by reinventing herself in public as a glamorous European hostess, and in private as a woman in a permanent state of pursued performance. Antony Baekeland, called Tony, was born in August 1946. He was their only child. He was beautiful from infancy, with very pale blonde hair and very large gray eyes. Photographs survive of him at 3 and 4, in the apartments of his parents' friends in Manhattan, in Paris, in Rome, standing very still beside his mother, looking always at the camera. His father was rarely in the room. His mother dressed him in linen and silk, took him to the dressmakers with her, sat him at the dinner table among adults from the age of 5, and treated him from the beginning, not as a child, but as a particularly accomplished accessory. By the standards of a New York child of the late 1940s and early 50s, Tony's life was a strange, unbroken voyage. He saw more of the inside of transatlantic ocean liners and Pan-American flying boats than he saw of schoolyards. He learned to read in 2 languages by tracking his mother's manicured fingertip across the pages of French and English picture books. He spent his 5th birthday on the deck of a yacht off Capri in the company of 3 actors and a Russian count. He spent his 6th in a rented apartment on the Rue de Bourgogne in Paris in evening clothes, listening to a string quartet his mother had hired for the occasion. The pleasures were genuine. The continuity was not. There were no fixed schools. The family moved. They lived in Paris for 2 years, in New York for 1, in a rented villa on the Riviera for a summer, in a particular house outside Closters in the Swiss Alps for a winter. Tony was passed between English, French, and American tutors. His mother believed in surrounding him with talented adults, and she did. By the time he was 8, he could conduct a polite conversation in 3 languages. By the time he was 12, he was reading the French poets in the original. He had no friends his own age. He had no continuity of place. He had a mother who watched him constantly, and a father who passed through the room like a man on a train. He was, in every photograph of him as a child, slightly to one side, always near her, always alone. The first symptom no one wanted to see appeared in the spring of his 14th year, in a rented house in Cadogan, in Spain. Tony walked into the kitchen one afternoon and told the cook in calm Spanish that the woman in the painting in the dining room had been speaking to him for 3 days and that he did not want her to anymore. The cook told Barbara. Barbara took the painting down. The matter was not mentioned again. 2 months later, on the terrace at sunset, Tony said the same thing about a bowl of fruit. Barbara took the bowl away. The doctors in Cadogan and the doctors in Madrid and the doctors at the American hospital in Paris were not consulted. The painting and the bowl were removed, and Tony was kissed on the forehead and taken to bed, and the household carried on. The thing his mother believed about him, more powerfully than she believed in any diagnosis, was that he was a poet, that he was a special boy, that he was different from other children in the way that beautiful and sensitive boys are different. She did not believe in psychosis. She believed in poetry. The architecture of denial began that summer. It would last another 12 years. At the end of those 12 years, it would kill her. Chapter 5. A Mother Who Would Not Listen. 3 psychiatrists in 3 countries told Brooks and Barbara Baekeland the same thing about their son, and they each in turn were politely shown the door. The first was a doctor in New York in 1962, when Tony was 16, after he had been found in the family bathroom, holding a razor blade against his own throat and laughing. The doctor told Barbara that her son was in the early stages of a severe psychotic illness and required immediate inpatient care. Barbara explained to the doctor that Tony was sensitive, that he had been at parties recently with a difficult crowd, and that they were leaving the country in 2 weeks for Mallorca. She did not bring Tony back for the second appointment. The second was a doctor in Paris in 1964. Tony had been hospitalized briefly for a head injury after a fight with his father. The Parisian psychiatrist visited him in the small private clinic at Neuilly. He sat with the boy for an hour. He came out and told Brooks that the case was severe paranoid schizophrenia of early onset and that without treatment, the patient would deteriorate within a few years to the point of violence. Brooks listened. Brooks said he would think about it. Brooks then took his son back to the rented apartment on the Rue de Varenne and never mentioned the visit again. The third was a London doctor in 1969. By then, Tony had been admitted briefly to a private clinic in Hampstead after assaulting a stranger on the Underground. The London doctor diagnosed the illness for the 3rd time. He told Barbara, who had flown over from New York, that her son required a long-term secure facility. Barbara took the doctor to lunch at Claridge's. She listened. She did not commit her son. She paid the bill at the clinic and removed him. By her own letters, preserved later by the painter Heather Cohane, she felt that institutions were brutal places that broke people. By her own letters, the alternative she preferred, repeatedly, was to keep her son very close, to dress him beautifully, to take him with her to parties, and to find people who could love him out of his unhappiness. The people she found were women. By Tony's 17th year, his mother had begun to arrange, with a frankness that none of her friends had quite the courage to challenge, for women to spend nights with her son. She believed that he was confused about his sexuality. He had told her, gently in his 16th year, that he believed he loved men. She refused the information. She brought women home from her dinner parties, women who, in some cases, were paid out of her own household account, and arranged for them to sleep with him. He, in the course of these encounters, often left the room and went and sat in the kitchen and stared at the wall. He told one of these women, a French art critic named Yvette, who later told the story to Heather Cohane and to the writers of Savage Grace, that he was waiting for his mother to come and take him to bed herself. 3 friends of Barbara's in the late 1960s told the same private story, with appalled consistency, that there was an unmistakable atmosphere in the household, that Barbara and Tony slept in connected rooms, that mother and son sometimes appeared at breakfast in matching dressing gowns, and that the boundary between them had ceased to exist. In 1967, Brooks Baekeland left Barbara for the young Sue Guinness, the daughter of one of Barbara's closest friends. He took a small Spanish villa with Sue. He cut Barbara's allowance to $30,000 a year, the equivalent of about $220,000 today, plus money toward Tony's care. Barbara reacted to her husband's departure with the only response she knew: theater. She staged 2 suicide attempts in 1968 and one in 1970. Each was loud enough to bring doctors and quiet enough that the doctors agreed she would survive. Tony was there each time. He sat with her in the hospital corridors. He held her hand. He went home with her to whatever apartment they were in that month. He stopped sleeping at night and began to walk the rooms in the dark. By the autumn of 1972, they were alone together in a 16-room rented penthouse at 81 Cadogan Square in Knightsbridge, London. Brooks was in Spain. The cook had been let go. The Spanish maid came in by day. Barbara wrote letters to old friends in which she described Tony's behavior as difficult and his sleeping as poor. Tony, in his letters to the painter Sam Green and to 1 or 2 friends from his New York adolescence, wrote sentences that were no longer coherent. He described a great machine outside the window. He believed the milk delivered to the door was being modified. He had begun to refuse food. On the morning of November 17, 1972, Barbara woke late, made tea, and told the Spanish maid that she was thinking of taking Tony to Paris the following week. She and Tony had a long, mostly silent lunch. In the afternoon, Tony went out for a walk. He returned in the evening. There was a brief argument about a dinner Barbara had not cooked. Tony took a kitchen knife from the drawer. Barbara was sitting at the desk by the window. Tony walked across the room. He stabbed her in the chest. She fell. He stabbed her once more, in the back. He stood up. He walked into the kitchen. He picked up the telephone. He called the Chinese restaurant on Sloane Street and ordered a takeaway dinner for one. Then he called the police. He told them, when they arrived, that his mother was happier now. He sat in the corner of the room, and he did not resist the constables. He let them take the knife out of his hand. He let them take him out of the building. He was tried in London in 1973. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to Broadmoor Hospital. He served 8 years. He spent them painting in his cell, writing letters in his neat handwriting, asking after his cousins, asking after his father, asking when he could go home. Chapter 6. The Knife. At Cadogan Square. The takeaway food arrived first, and the policeman arrived after, and Tony was the one who had called both of them. The Cadogan Square police constables had not seen anything like it in a long career on a quiet beat. They opened the door to find a slim young man with blonde hair, in a navy sweater and dark trousers, sitting at a small writing desk near his mother's body. The mother was face down on the carpet between the desk and the window. The kitchen knife was on the floor beside the desk. The penthouse was quiet. The bell rang. The young man stood up and went past them to answer it. The delivery boy from the Chinese restaurant was at the door with a paper bag. Tony took the bag, paid, came back, set the bag on the desk, and asked the constables if they would like tea. He spoke perfect English. He had no blood on him, except a small mark across the right cuff. He was calm. The British press picked the story up the following morning, the 17th becoming the 18th, and they did not at first know what to make of it. He was the great-grandson of a famous American inventor. His parents were known, distantly, in New York and Paris society. The mother was beautiful and dead. The son had killed her with a kitchen knife. The setting was Knightsbridge, the kind of address that did not generate news of this kind. The papers at first treated the case as a quiet, distant tragedy. By the end of the week it had become, in London at least, a minor sensation. The trial in the spring of 1973 was attended by very few of the family's American friends. Brooks Bakeland did not come over from Spain. He sent a telegram. He sent a small payment toward the legal costs. He had already cut off his son in every meaningful way years earlier. Broadmoor in those years was not the closed and televised institution it would later become. It was a high-security psychiatric hospital with a relatively benign approach to those of its patients who had committed crimes during clear psychosis and who responded to medication. Tony was placed in a single room. He was given antipsychotic drugs. The voices in the painting and in the bowl of fruit and outside the window quietened. He began to paint again. He wrote letters. He read. He showed by all accounts a curious, wistful, gentle quality that surprised the staff and the other patients. He attended the small classes the hospital ran. He asked after relatives. He asked after his cousins in New York. He asked repeatedly after his grandmother, Nina Daly, Barbara's mother, who was in her 70s and lived alone in a small apartment on East 86th Street in Manhattan. He wrote to her every week. He told her he was sorry. He told her he was getting better. He told her that he wanted to come home. The case for Tony's release was made by a combination of his apparent stability on medication, the absence of any other crime, the relative ease with which he could be supervised by his elderly grandmother in New York, and the steady pressure of his small surviving legal team, paid for out of what remained of the family money. Brooks Bakeland did not object. Sue Guinness Bakeland did not object. The American authorities accepted the British recommendation. He was released conditionally in July 1980. He flew from London to New York on a regular commercial flight, accompanied by a hospital escort to the gate. He carried a small leather suitcase. He carried his medication in a labeled plastic bottle. He carried a notebook and a tin of paints. He was 33 years old. He stepped off the plane in Manhattan into a city he had not seen for nearly a decade. His grandmother met him at the airport. She was 88. She had loved him as a child and had not seen the worst of him as an adult. She had been ill-prepared by her doctors, by his lawyers, and by her own surviving daughter Elizabeth Archer for what would arrive. She drove with him in a taxi from Kennedy to her apartment on the Upper East Side. She made him tea. She gave him a bedroom. She gave him a key to the front door. She went to bed early. She left her medications, including a small kitchen knife she used for arthritis pain in her hand, on the bedside table. In the small hours of the morning, the 18th of July, 1980, Tony walked into her bedroom with the kitchen knife and stabbed her 8 times. She fought. She was 88 years old, and she fought him for nearly 2 minutes. She got herself out of the bedroom into the hallway. She crawled to the door. She unbolted it and opened it and screamed in the hallway, and the woman from the apartment opposite came out. Tony stood in the doorway watching. Nina Daly lived. She lost the use of one hand. She lived another 6 years. She refused ever afterward to allow her grandson's name to be spoken in her presence. Tony was arrested. He was held at the Bellevue Psychiatric Ward and then transferred to Rikers Island. He was placed in administrative segregation. He was given antipsychotic medication. His attorneys filed a motion for transfer to a secure psychiatric facility. The motion took months to process. On March 21, 1981, 6 days after his arrival at the Rikers facility, he took a plastic shopping bag from his bedding and put it over his head and tied it under his chin and lay down on his back and suffocated. He was 34 years old. His mother had been dead for 8 years. His father was in Spain. He had no surviving siblings. His ashes were buried, eventually, in a small cemetery on Long Island near the grave of his mother. The Cadogan Square penthouse was rented to a new tenant within 8 months. The Bakelite that had begun in a Yonkers carriage house in 1907 was, by this point, mostly a collectible plastic that older people remembered. The fortune that the discipline of the founder had built had run, in 3 generations, into a London bedroom and a Rikers cell. Chapter 7. The last heir of a chemical empire. He owned 800 acres of Pennsylvania countryside and several $100 million and the loneliest interior life of any man on the East Coast. John Eleuthère DuPont was born in November 1938 on the Foxcatcher estate at Newtown Square, west of Philadelphia, the 4th child of William DuPont Jr. and Jean Lister Austin DuPont. The DuPont name went back to a French émigré, Eleuthère Irénée Dupont de Nemours, who had landed at Newport in 1800, carrying a private fortune in Spanish silver and an unfinished design for an improved gunpowder mill. He set the mill on the Brandywine, downstream from Wilmington, in 1802. By the time of the Civil War, the DuPont Gunpowder Works was the largest in the country and had supplied the Union Army with most of its black powder. By 1900, the company had moved into smokeless powder, dynamite, and high explosives, and by the 1930s, under Pierre DuPont's reorganization, into chemicals, cellophane, neoprene, nylon, and shortly after, Teflon, Kevlar, and Lycra. The DuPont company at its height was one of the 3 or 4 largest chemical manufacturers on Earth. John's father, William Jr., was a quiet, sportsman-wealthy DuPont who kept horses and lived for the racing season. His mother, Jean Lister, was the powerful one. She came from a Pennsylvania Quaker family of considerable means, and she ran the estate at Foxcatcher as her personal kingdom. The 800 acres held the main house, several smaller cottages, stables, gardens, a swimming pool, a private museum, and, in time, a wrestling facility John would build for himself. Jean Lister rode every morning. She bred horses. She ran a household staff that varied, depending on the season, between 15 and 40 people. She ran her family the same way. John was the youngest. He was small, awkward, fanatical about birds, and starved for his mother's full attention in a way she never gave him. He grew up under her, in the shape she imposed. His 3 older siblings escaped into adult lives. John stayed. In 1965, he graduated from the University of Miami with a degree in zoology. He became briefly a published ornithologist. He wrote a book on Philippine birds. He had himself listed as a co-author on subsequent volumes. He kept a vast aviary at Foxcatcher. He published in 1973 an extensive monograph on the seabirds of the Central Pacific. The work was real. The work was modest. The fortune was vast and growing. When his mother died in 1988, she left him the bulk of Foxcatcher and a share of the family trusts that estimates at the time placed it between $250 and $400 million. He was 50 years old. He was twice divorced. He was unmarried. He had no children. He had a .44 caliber revolver in the drawer of his desk and a habit of pacing the estate at 3 in the morning. He had an ambition he had been refining for 2 decades. He wanted to be a coach. It was, in his own private accounting, the great achievement of his life. The ambition began in modesty. John DuPont had been a competitive swimmer in college. He had built, in the early 1970s, a swimming pool at Foxcatcher and brought in young competitive swimmers to train there. He had himself photographed in the role of patron and coach. He paid for the renovation of the swimming program at Villanova University, his name affixed to the new natatorium. By the late 1970s, he had moved his attention to amateur wrestling. He admired wrestlers as much as he admired birds. He believed that American freestyle wrestlers were the truest athletes in the country, undervalued and underfunded. He saw an opening for a wealthy patron. He began to host wrestlers at the estate. He renamed his property Team Foxcatcher. He commissioned a world-class wrestling facility, the John E. DuPont Wrestling Center, on the grounds. He paid an annual stipend, the figures ranging from $15,000 to $50,000, depending on the wrestler's standing, in addition to housing on the estate, a vehicle, and the use of the facilities. He had himself sworn in as a wrestling coach, by his own private definition of the role. He demanded that the resident wrestlers refer to him as Coach DuPont. They did. He had a uniform made for himself with his name and the words head coach embroidered on the chest. He kept the uniform pressed and hung in a corner of the main gym. He wore it on team photograph days. He stood in the center of the photographs, his hands on the shoulders of 2 of his Olympic medalists, with the look of a man who had finally arrived at a place he had been picturing in his head for 50 years. By 1987, he had attracted Dave Schultz. Dave Schultz was an Olympic gold medalist from the 1984 Los Angeles Games in the 74-kilogram freestyle class. He was the older brother of Mark Schultz, also an Olympic gold medalist from the same games. The Schultz brothers were the most accomplished American freestyle wrestlers of their generation. David, in particular, was loved. He was a generous, patient, deeply humorous man with a thick beard and pale blue eyes and an unmistakable kindness that made people, including John DuPont, lean toward him in a room. He had married Nancy and had 2 small children. He needed a base. The Foxcatcher offer was generous. He moved his family into a cottage on the estate in 1987. He believed that he could help American wrestling by helping John DuPont stabilize a training program. The years between 1987 and 1993 on the estate were, for the most part, productive. Foxcatcher wrestlers won medals at World Championships and at the Seoul and Barcelona Olympics. The American Wrestling Federation grew dependent on John's money. The estate seemed to function, at least to the outside world, like a serious training center. Inside the gates, the picture was harder to read. John drank steadily. He spoke increasingly of conspiracies. He fixated, then released, then refixated on individual wrestlers. He fired security teams in waves. He bought a tank, an actual armored personnel carrier, from a military auction, and drove it on the grounds. He demanded the swimming pool be drained because he believed enemies had poisoned it. He kept the .44 caliber revolver on his person. He began, in 1994, to carry a second pistol. Dave Schultz, who saw John more often than anyone else on the estate, told friends and family in the autumn of 1995 that John was not well. He said he was thinking of moving Nancy and the children off the estate. He had not moved them by January 1996. Chapter 8. The Coach Who Was Coming Apart. He had ghosts in the walls and Nazis in the trees and a .44 caliber revolver in the waistband of his trousers at 3 in the morning. By the autumn of 1995, the Foxcatcher estate was no longer running as a wrestling training center. The wrestlers were still there. The facility was still there. The salaries still arrived. But the man at the center of the operation had moved into a different country inside his own head. He had stopped sleeping. He had stopped eating with the rest of the household. He had taken to standing in his own front hall at 2 and 3 in the morning in a bathrobe with the revolver tucked into the cord, calling for the night staff to come and verify that there was no one on the lawn. He had ordered the gardener to cut down a row of black willows that lined a particular pond because he believed they hid surveillance equipment. He had banned the color black from the estate. The wrestlers were required to repaint the dumbbells and the racks. The black shirts in the gym were thrown out. He had ordered the geese on the property killed because he believed they were broadcasting his movements. He had driven his Lincoln Town car into a different pond and then refused to acknowledge that he had been driving. He believed the staff had moved the car there to embarrass him. He had begun to fire the wrestlers' assistants for crimes they had not committed. He had begun very slowly to fixate on David Schultz. The fixation alternated. On a good day, John still trusted David, still considered him a brother. On a bad day, John believed David was a foreign agent. He believed David's beard hid a microphone. He believed Nancy was a Soviet operative. He believed Mark Schultz was a CIA officer. He believed the Wrestling Federation had been infiltrated. He carried a list of names in his pocket. He believed his older brother, Henry Baekeland DuPont II, had been killed and replaced by a double. Henry was, in fact, alive. The brothers had not spoken in 2 years. His former wife, Gail Wenck, had warned the family. She had been married to John for a single year in 1983 and 84. She had divorced him after, by her own sworn account, he had held her at gunpoint, attempted to throw her from a moving car, and ordered her to leave the estate at gunpoint in the middle of a winter night. She had told the DuPont family attorneys. She had told the police in Newtown Square. The attorneys had quieted the matter. The police, who had been on the receiving end of large gifts from John, including a fleet of patrol vehicles, did not press. She left and warned anyone who would listen that he would, at some point, kill a person on the estate. She was a 30-year-old divorcee with no family money, and the DuPont family had paid her a generous settlement. Few people listened. David Schultz listened to her. In a phone call in 1994, he told her he was concerned. He told her he believed he could manage John. He told her that he had a strategy for keeping John stable, which was to be calm, to be present, to be patient. He had told the same thing to his brother Mark. Mark had left the estate in 1989, partly because John's behavior had become impossible to live with. Mark had begged David to leave. David, who had a small son and a small daughter and a particular kind of conscience, would not. The senior coaches at Foxcatcher had stopped going to the main house unless explicitly summoned. The morning training schedule was being run by an assistant. The grounds crew had been instructed to enter the residence only through the kitchen door and never to walk on the front lawn. Several of the wrestlers' wives had quietly moved their children off the estate during the previous summer and were renting houses in Newtown Square. The atmosphere had the heaviness of a household in which a serious illness is unfolding, but no one is allowed to use the word for it. A small private meeting of 3 senior wrestlers had taken place in early January in a diner on Westchester Pike. The agenda, as one of those wrestlers later told the state police, had been whether to call the family lawyers and force a committal. They had decided to wait 1 more week. They were waiting still. In the second week of January 1996, John fired 3 more staff members. He stopped attending the daily training sessions. He sat in the main house in the dark, drinking, with the curtains drawn. The wrestlers and the cooks and the security men did not see him for 3 days. On the evening of January 25th, he sent for his head of security, Patrick Goodale, and demanded that they drive around the perimeter of the estate. Goodale agreed. They drove for 2 hours in the Lincoln. John pointed at trees. He pointed at fence posts. He said that someone was in the southwest field. There was no one in the southwest field. Goodale agreed to check. He went back to the security office. He did not call the police. He did not warn the wrestlers. He believed, by his own later testimony, that John was having a bad night and would settle by morning. He went home at midnight. He left the revolver, the second pistol, the rifles in the gun cabinet of the main house, the second-floor study with the ammunition, all entirely accessible. The morning of January 26th was cold and gray. There was thin snow on the gravel drive. David Schultz left his cottage at about 9:30 to drive his small Toyota Tercel to the wrestling facility for the morning session. The Tercel had a sluggish engine in cold weather. He propped the hood and stood in the driveway with the engine running, leaning under the hood, working on the choke linkage with a screwdriver from his back pocket. Nancy Schultz was inside the cottage with their 2 children. She saw the Lincoln Town car come up the drive. She knew the car. It was John's. The car stopped at the end of the drive. The driver door opened. John got out. He walked across the gravel. David stood up from under the hood and turned. He smiled. He raised a hand. He was always polite to John. He had begun to say, "Hello, Coach." He did not finish. Chapter 9. 3 shots in the driveway. David Schultz was working on the engine of his Toyota Tercel when the Lincoln pulled up the gravel drive of the cottage DuPont had given him. The first shot took him in the left elbow. He turned. The second shot took him in the center of the chest. He fell back against the wing of the car. The third shot, fired from above as he lay on the gravel, went into his face. He was 36 years old. He had 2 children. He had won an Olympic gold medal at 24. He died on the driveway in front of his wife. Nancy Schultz came out of the cottage at a dead run. She tried to lift him. He was already gone. She ran back inside and called the police. John DuPont drove the Lincoln slowly back across the estate to the main house. He drove the Lincoln into the garage. He went into the house. He locked the doors. He cut the telephone lines in the kitchen. He pulled the curtains. He went into the study on the second floor. He opened the gun cabinet. He took out his rifles. He sat down at his desk. He had killed a man who had been one of the few people in the world who had treated him with consistent kindness. He sat for a long time. The Pennsylvania State Police arrived within 20 minutes. They evacuated the wrestlers and the children. They cordoned off the estate. They surrounded the main house. They tried the doors. They tried the windows. They called inside on the loudspeaker. John did not respond. He had withdrawn into the upper floors. He had the rifles. He had the .44 caliber revolver. He had access to ammunition. He had food and water. The temperature was falling. He stayed. He held the police off for 48 hours. The press began to arrive almost immediately. By the second morning, a row of satellite trucks ran the length of the driveway and the surrounding country lane. The story had moved instantly from a quiet murder in Newtown Square to a national event. He was, the press said, the heir to the DuPont fortune. He was an eccentric millionaire. He was a wrestling patron. He was the man in Foxcatcher. He had killed the Olympic champion Dave Schultz. He was now inside the mansion with a gun. By the afternoon of January 28th, the state police had developed a plan. The temperature was below freezing. The wind was sharp. The house, large as it was poorly insulated, and the heating ran on an oil furnace at the rear. The officer in charge ordered the supply line cut. The furnace stopped. Within 4 hours, the temperature inside the house had begun to drop. By 6 in the evening, John was visibly distressed. The boiler shut down completely. He sent staff out earlier in the day. The house was now empty. He came down to the kitchen. He looked through the back window. He saw the furnace was out. He opened the back door and walked across the small porch to inspect the furnace at the side of the house. He was unarmed. 2 state troopers stationed in the bushes took him from behind. He went down without resistance. He was arrested at 6:20 in the evening on January 28, 1996. He stood trial in 1997. The defense brought in a long succession of psychiatrists who described in detail a man in a sustained paranoid schizophrenic episode that had begun, by their dating, no later than 1992 and had escalated, untreated, to homicidal psychosis. The defense sought a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution argued that he had known what he was doing and that he had killed David Schultz in cold blood. The jury, after a long deliberation, found him guilty of third-degree murder, but mentally ill. He was sentenced to 13 to 30 years. He was sent to the State Correctional Institution at Cresson in central Pennsylvania. He was placed in protective custody. He refused to be addressed by his real name. He demanded to be called the Dalai Lama of the United States. He died in the prison on December 9, 2010, at the age of 72, of complications of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and emphysema. His body was returned in a private cortege to the family burying ground at the Brandywine. Foxcatcher was sold. The wrestling center was dismantled. Nancy Schultz raised her 2 children alone. She campaigned for the rest of her active years for a serious reckoning with the way Pennsylvania mental health law and Pennsylvania police practice had failed to act on years of evidence that her husband's killer was an armed and deteriorating man. The estate that had been an inherited kingdom became, in time, a development of houses and a memorial plaque. Orange Chapter 10. The trials. That money bought. The lawyers in the 3 cases never met one another, but they argued exactly the same case in 3 different centuries. They argued, in turn, that Harry Thaw had killed Stanford White in a state of temporary madness called Dementia Americana. the natural rage of an American husband. They argued that Tony Baekeland had killed Barbara Baekeland in a state of acute psychosis that no reasonable person could have controlled. They argued that John DuPont had killed David Schultz in a state of paranoid schizophrenia, that his fortune had been unable to medicate or commit. The three defenses are, in their essential shape, one defense. The rich man was not himself when he killed. The rich man cannot be held to the standard of the poor man, because the rich man was, by reason of inheritance, not subject to the friction that holds a poor man together. The same case, dressed in 3 different decades' clothing, comes back to court every 30 years. Delphin Delmas, the San Francisco trial lawyer who came to New York to defend Harry Thaw in 1907, was paid by Mary Copley Thaw's account, a fee equivalent today of more than $1 million. He was a small theatrical man who arrived in court each day in a tightly cut frock coat and spoke for hours at a time in long, finely polished sentences. He coined Dementia Americana on the courthouse steps and trained 2 psychiatric witnesses to recite it under oath. The hung jury that resulted in 1907 was, in the lawyer's private calculus, a victory. The not guilty by reason of insanity verdict in 1908 was the full prize. Harry was committed to a hospital his family could remove him from. 6 years later, he was free. The Baekeland defense in London in 1973 was quieter and shorter, partly because Tony's psychiatric state was visible to the court without ornament. He sat through the trial without speaking. He stared at the table. His attorneys, paid by what remained of the Baekeland trusts, argued the bare minimum. Broadmoor was the easiest path. Broadmoor was the path the court took. The British system, less prone than the American to spectacle, returned the verdict without much fanfare. The fortune behind the case was nevertheless real. Without the attorneys, and without the small surviving family financial cushion, he would have spent the rest of his life in a much less comfortable institution. The DuPont trial in 1997 was the most lawyered and the most expensive of the 3. The defense team retained, at various points, Thomas Bergstrom, Richard Sprague, and a stable of psychiatric experts whose total billings are estimated to have exceeded $4 million. The defense argued not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution, led by the Delaware County District Attorney's Office, argued guilty in the first degree. The jury, after a deliberation of 1 week, returned a compromise, guilty of murder in the 3rd degree, but mentally ill. The sentence was a maximum of 30 years in a state correctional institution. It was not the asylum the defense had sought. It was not the maximum penalty the prosecution had sought. It was, in the long American history of rich killers, a near-perfect example of money's reach. It did not save him from prison, but it took the verdict halfway home. There is a common pattern across the 3 trials. The defense in each case had unlimited resources. The defense in each case was able to deploy psychiatric expertise that the prosecution did not have the budget to match. The defense in each case relied on the public assumption that a rich man's mind is more delicate than a poor man's mind, that wealth has psychological fragility built into it as a kind of inevitable cost, and that the natural law of consequence is somehow suspended for an heir. The juries in the 3 cases largely accepted this. The wider public mostly accepted it too. The killings were absorbed. The killers, in 2 of the 3 cases, walked. The 3rd, John DuPont, was at least sent away. He still died in a cell appointed to a man with his own private television set. Chapter 11. The Families That Were Hollowed Out. Mary Copley Thaw lost the family standing she had spent 40 years building, and she never got it back. She had been a leading philanthropist of Pittsburgh, a major donor to Princeton Theological Seminary, the named benefactor of a string of religious foundations across the eastern United States. After the murder of Stanford White, after the checks to attorneys and the checks to alienists and the checks to journalists, she became, in the eyes of New York and even of Pittsburgh, the woman who had bought her son's freedom. She died in 1929 at the age of 86. The obituaries were polite. The donations had continued. The standing was not the same. Brooks Bakeland died in Spain in 1996. He had married Sue Guinness in 1974. They had had one son, who was raised at a distance from the Bakeland legacy, and who later disowned the family name. Brooks had written a long, defensive memoir of his own life that he could not, in the end, find a publisher for. He had decided in the years after Tony's death that the failure had been his wife's and not his own. He gave interviews to Natalie Robbins for the book Savage Grace, in which he explained, in long sentences, the reasons it was Barbara who had ruined the boy. He explained Tony's illness as a function of Barbara's hysteria. He explained Tony's homosexuality as a function of Barbara's smothering. He explained his own absences as a function of the impossibility of life with Barbara. He died at 79, in a small Spanish village he had retired to. He left almost nothing. The Baekeland line is now, in essence, extinct. The DuPont family lost more than they would publicly admit. The wrestling program, which had been their public good face for 2 decades, was dismantled. The Foxcatcher estate was sold, parceled up, and developed. The film Foxcatcher, released in 2014, made the DuPont name, in particular John's DuPont name, into a synonym for a certain kind of unhealthy patronage. The wider family, the Pierres and Henrys, and the multiple cousins of the broader DuPont dynasty, continued to live well in Delaware and Pennsylvania, but the easy myth of DuPont enlightened civic generosity took a public hit that they spent the next 15 years quietly repairing. They did not invite John to family events in the last decade of his life. They did not visit him in prison. They did not, by all available accounts, write. Each of the 3 families lost more than they had built. The Thaws gave up $40 million of social standing, even as the money endured. The Bakelands lost their last direct heir, the only person who carried their name. The DuPonts lost a public face that had been, until the murder, a quiet asset. The architecture that had been built around each killer to protect him from consequence consumed the family that had built the architecture. The fortune ended up an instrument of its own erosion. The discipline of the founder did not save the house the founder built. There is a smaller, quieter loss to mention as well: the victims and their families. Stanford White's wife and son lived for many years in modest circumstances in St. James. Stanford White's reputation as an architect was overshadowed for half a century by the manner of his death, then slowly restored. Barbara Daley Baekeland's mother, Nina Daley, survived the attack, but never fully recovered the use of her right hand. She refused to speak of the events. She died alone in 1986. Nancy Schultz raised her 2 children alone in Pennsylvania. She worked for many years with American wrestling foundations to honor her husband's memory and to put proper safeguards in place around private patrons of amateur sport. The Dave Schultz Memorial International Tournament has been held every winter for 30 years in Colorado Springs. It is one of the few quiet good things to have grown out of any of the 3 cases. It exists because Nancy Schultz refused to let her husband's name be lost. There is a recurring detail across the 3 families that bears stating one more time. In each case, the people who tried to warn the wider world were ignored. Evelyn Nesbitt's earlier testimony, given to Harry Thaw's own attorneys in 1905, named Stanford White as her assailant and was filed quietly away in a drawer where it remained for the next century. The 3 psychiatrists who examined Tony Baekeland in New York, in Paris, and in London each warned Brooks and Barbara that their son required long-term secure psychiatric care, and each in turn was thanked and dismissed. Gail Wenk's sworn testimony about John DuPont's behavior, filed in her 1984 divorce papers and known to the DuPont family attorneys, was sealed and forgotten until after the killing. The warnings were always there. The warnings were always real. The warnings were always silenced. That is the most consistent fact across 90 years of these particular American killings. Chapter 12. What the fortune was hiding. A great fortune is supposed to be a defense against the world, and it is, but it is also a defense against the truth about yourself. The 3 men this film has tracked were not made monsters by their wealth alone. There are millions of inherited fortunes in America, large and small, and most of the heirs are kind, ordinary, anonymous, busy with their own quiet lives. The thing wealth did, in the 3 cases of Harry Thaw, Tony Baekeland, and John DuPont, was not to create the violence. It was to remove the thing that, in an ordinary life, would have arrested the violence early. The thing that holds most of us back from our own worst impulses is friction. It is the woman who refuses to take the check and goes to the police instead. It is the school that expels and does not negotiate. It is the doctor who insists on the institution. It is the friend who walks out of the room. The 3 men in this film grew up in a world in which every one of those frictions had been bought out. smoothed away, replaced by a check. They were not stopped because no one was empowered to stop them. We tell these stories as a culture in the wrong order. We arrive at the crime first. We watch the killer at his trial. We name him. We give him our attention. We treat him as the center. We do not name the lawyers. We do not name the alienists. We do not name the police chief who accepted the cars and the guns. We do not name the journalist who took the briefing. We do not name the family doctor who wrote a comforting note for the family file rather than a referral to a secure psychiatric facility. We do not name the editor who muted the story. We do not name the chorus girl who took the payment and went away. The architecture that allowed the killer to keep going is not, in most of these accounts, visible at all. It is the invisible scaffolding under the building. It is the thing the founder bought all those years ago with the discipline of his 14-hour days. The founders are, in a certain sense, the most interesting characters in this whole study. William Thaw rose at 4 a.m. for 40 years to read railroad accounts. Leo Baekeland kept a black ink laboratory journal for 2 decades while he chased the synthetic resin that no one before him had been able to produce. The early DuPonts ran the gunpowder mill at the Brandywine through war and through fire, and through the slow 18th century industry of patient experimentation. None of these 3 men were, on the available evidence, particularly gentle, particularly warm, particularly easy to live with. But the work itself imposed a shape on them. They could not afford to be anything other than disciplined. They were held in place by the thing they were building. Their grandsons and great-grandsons inherited the money. They did not inherit the holding place. With nothing to push against, the inner life of the heir simply expanded outward into whatever shape it found within itself. For Harry Thaw, it found rage at a man in a velvet swing. For Antony Baekeland, it found voices in a painting and a knife on a Knightsbridge floor. For John DuPont, it found enemies in the trees and a gun in the waistband at 3 a.m. We owe the dead in these stories more than we usually pay them. Stanford White was a working architect with a complicated private life and a brilliant body of public work. He should have lived another 25 years. He should have died in old age, in a chair, in his house in Long Island. Barbara Daly Baekeland was a vain, beautiful, frightened, ambitious woman who could not see the danger she was in. She should have died in old age too. David Schultz was the best of them. He was a kind, gentle, deeply gifted athlete who believed, until the last moment, that the rich man inside the mansion was a sick patron he could help. He died on a gravel drive in front of his wife. He left 2 small children. We do not pay these 3 deaths their due weight when we are dazzled by the trials and the asylums and the architecture of impunity that swallowed them. There is one more piece of this that bears saying out loud. Each of the 3 founders, when he set the original fortune in motion, would almost certainly have wanted his great-grandson to be a useful citizen of the country. William Thaw believed in the Pittsburgh he had helped to build, and he gave to its institutions accordingly. Leo Baekeland gave the patent rights to his synthetic resin to a national company because he believed industrial chemistry would lift the standard of living for ordinary American families. The early DuPonts paid wages above the regional average at the Brandywine mill because they considered the workers neighbors. None of these founders, on any honest reading of their letters and their account books, dreamed of a great-grandson sitting in a darkened mansion at 3 a.m. with a loaded revolver in his waistband. None of them dreamed of a son putting 3 bullets into the architect of a public theater. None of them dreamed of a boy stabbing his own mother in a London drawing room. The fortunes were intended to do something else. The fortunes broke in the 3rd generation in ways the 1st generation could not have foreseen. If there is a final question this story asks you, it is this. The next time you read of a rich man who is killed, ask not how the killing happened. Ask who paid the lawyer. Ask who quieted the doctor. Ask who took the gift and looked the other way. Ask who built the protection. The killer is the headline. The architecture is the story. And the architecture, in every case, is built long before the gun is fired, by people who would prefer that no one knew their names. If you have made it to this point, you have given me your most valuable possession, which is your time, and I am grateful. Hit the subscribe button below this video so you do not miss the next story in this series of Old Money Corrupts. Then drop a comment with where you are watching from and tell me which of these 3 men shocked you most. Harry Thaw on the rooftop, Antony Baekeland at the kitchen table, or John DuPont in the snow. I read every comment. You are the reason this channel exists.